Hey everybody, and welcome to another Tausken review. Today we'll be taking a look at Jedi Fallen Order. It's been a little bit rough for Star Wars fans out there since EA took over the license with only Battlefront 1 and Battlefront 2 since EA got that license, and I found myself pretty disappointed like others when they have not really pumped anything out. And this was made worse by the fact that the original footage and trailers for Jedi Fallen Order looked pretty bland and generic, but fortunately, I can say that Jedi Fallen Order is the best Star Wars game in recent years. So Jedi Fallen Order takes place between episodes 3 and 4. You play as Cal Kestis, a Jedi who's been living on the edge of the galaxy just trying to survive basically since the Purge of the Jedi, just hiding out. It's one of the better Star Wars games ever made with a pretty fantastic cast and enjoyable story. I found that this was much more interesting to get into than a lot of the other Star Wars games in recent years. It felt like I could actually relate to Cal's character. Now, I won't really get into too many spoilers by any means, so I'll kind of be vague here, but it does a pretty good job with some of the emotions of Star Wars and some of the events that are between the episodes of 3 and 4, which is pretty cool to see fleshed out in this way. The writing is fairly good with some decent twists and turns. There's some pretty good dialogue for all the characters, so I never really felt like any of them felt artificial or fake. There's also a ton of different nuggets for fans of Star Wars with references to the Clone Wars and Rebels TV shows that really haven't been seen in other games or some of the episodes even that have been the movies, which is pretty cool. You get to explore some locations and things found in those two TV shows. The facial animations and graphical design of all the characters is pretty great, except for Ciri. Ciri isn't overall bad, but there's just something odd about her eyes. It really looks kind of bug-like. They don't blink at all, too, which is just really weird, and it's kind of distracting every time she's in the actual scenes of the game. But for the most part, I'd say that most of it's good. There's some odd lip-syncing here and there, but it's nothing that really pulled me out of the experience by any means. One thing I did not like about the story is that it felt like some of the supporting characters didn't have a whole lot to do, which is a bit of a bummer. There's some pretty interesting, great characters here, and I feel like they could have a lot of interesting things to say and do, but they just don't really get anything to really do. There's Ciri and the other cast that are on your ship, and it's kind of bland when you just don't really get to do anything with them. They basically just talk to you and tell you different things from a distance while they're on the ship as you're exploring the planet. It never really feels like they're attached to the story. And as a result, it kind of feels like you're the only thing pushing the story forward. Another problem I'd say with the story is that it doesn't have the best pacing. It feels a bit like it can drag on in some parts, and it doesn't exactly feel like it has a cohesive forward moving motion. There's parts where it'll be like, go to this planet, you'll do like a couple things on there for 10-15 minutes, and then you'll go bounce over to another planet and then bounce back to that planet, and it just gets kind of stupid and old. It doesn't feel like it's the most well structured from that standpoint of progressing you through a clean route. Now, moving away from the story and onto the gameplay, it's a bit like a mix of Dark Souls and God of War. And what I mean by that is that it's a challenging game like Dark Souls. It's pretty hard, the enemies are difficult, and you gain, kind of like a soul system, you gain experience as you kill enemies, and if you die, you have to go back and retrieve it. It's very similar to that regard. You also find little things that are basically the equivalent of bonfires where you go and level up. As far as the God of War comparison, it's got a very similar kind of style to the platforming mechanics of God of War and the puzzly aspects of going into areas and trying to solve things to get through. Puzzles themselves are interesting and fairly well designed for the most part. They aren't particularly massively challenging, but some can be a little bit difficult. I felt like they do some interesting, clever things with them though, so they're definitely worthwhile additions. As far as the combat goes, I felt like it was pretty solid. It was very fun to use the lightsabers and things. It felt very visceral in the sense that like your lightsaber is very strong, it's powerful, it can just swipe people down really quickly. It's very much like Dark Souls where you're like 1-on-1 against a guy or 1-on-5 or something small like that. It's also pretty intense when you get into these battles as you're swiping away, trying to parry, dodge, block, and do things against different stormtroopers that have different weapons or other creatures. The one area I did feel like could be massively improved is the force powers. It's just so lame when you're playing a Star Wars game that has bad force powers. And I get it, it's not like other games where you can choose to be an evil Sith Lord or anything, so you're not going to force lightning or anything, but there's so much more you can do here. And it's really bland that The Force Unleashed, that was released so many years ago, has so much more exciting force powers. I would have loved to have been able to grab different objects or move stormtroopers around, but really you don't get anything like that. Everything's very scripted. You can use your force powers to break different walls or pull things, but it's all, like I said, scripted. It's only at moments the game chooses to allow you to do it. You can do a couple okay things, like you could pull a stormtrooper towards you and swing them with your lightsaber, push them off a cliff edge, which is cool, but there's just not enough here. It's like basically force push, force pull, and slow, and that's it. That's all you've got, which is so boring. Star Wars is so big about force powers, especially when you're playing a game that centers around a Jedi character. I don't understand how you can do this so bad. The other couple things that I don't really like about the gameplay is the generic monsters. You've got things like spiders and baby rancors and stormtroopers, and that's really about it. The game reuses a ton of monsters, and it gets old, especially when you've got like 2 different planets that have spider creatures. It just gets ridiculous. I also felt like the progression could be a little bit more interesting. There's just not enough interesting abilities or things to pick up. It's kind of like you're just picking up pretty generic things like, here's more health, here's access to this tiny little ability that's barely usable, or here's 1 extra force power, which, as I mentioned before, aren't very fun. It feels like there's not enough to really pick here, and you can kind of get everything basically anyway, so there's not really any specialization here. The game also seemed to have some performance issues. I was playing it on a 3900X processor and a 1080 Ti, but when I would come into new locations, it would just kind of stutter. I tried different graphics drivers and things like that, but it just didn't seem to help at all, and it seems like there are other people on the forum complaining about it, so I think it's just a known issue. And finally, as far as sound and graphics go, they're both pretty great. These sounds are very authentic to Star Wars and all sound great. The locations and levels look beautiful and are all very well rendered. Overall, Jedi Fallen Order gets an 8 out of 10. It's kind of close in many ways to getting a 7 out of 10. The reason I'm giving it an 8 out of 10 and not a 7 is because I feel like this game is a pretty well refined and solid game as a whole. It's got a lot of fun elements, and I feel like if it wasn't a Star Wars game, I probably wouldn't be complaining as much about a lot of different things. Particularly the force powers, which are such a core piece of Star Wars, but it does them so poorly in this game. They're just too scripted, and it's kind of disappointing that there's games that are over a decade earlier than this that still have done better and more interesting force powers in this game. Another area I did not like in this game is the story. It feels like it just meanders all over the place. The dialogue is really good, the voice acting is really good, the presentation is amazing, and all the graphics and everything come together to create a very immersive product. But it really fails when it comes to actually presenting a cohesive and interesting story. It kind of feels by the end of the game like the entire journey you went through is kind of pointless, and it meanders around all over the place, having to go between different planets for no real purpose. I also wish that some of the characters, like the ones on your ship, were more developed and had more opportunities on the screen. And I also wish that there was just more variety in the monsters. You've got giant spiders, giant rats, little rats, just all these generic, boring monsters, baby rancors and things like that. I would like to see more here. Despite all that, I think that Jedi Fallen Order is a pretty fun game. It's got interesting platforming, puzzle mechanics, it's got fun gameplay, it's fairly challenging, which is always good in my book. It's just a fun, well-designed game as a whole for the most part, aside from those couple issues I had earlier. I can highly recommend it to Star Wars fans. I think any Star Wars fan will probably love this game. And if you're on the fence about this game, you can pick up like Origin Access for $15 for 1 month and just play it and be done with it, because it's probably going to take you about 18 to 22 hours or so, somewhere around there. So you can beat it on that $15 and then not have to pay the full $60. But overall, I would recommend this game for anyone interested.